Hey friends.
Hey girl, hey. Yeah.
We're back in DC.
We're in DC at the Line Hotel in Adams Morgan, one of our very gracious hosts for the podcast.
Mm-hmm. It's so cute here. Okay. So, I guess we've become like resident Puff Daddy experts.
Diddy abuser. We are listening on the pulse of what is happening. I have to be honest with you. I spent much less time than you as a litigator, but I've been knee deep into all of the nuances around this case.
So I think this case is actually, it's not just this case that's getting people's attention. I mean, obviously this case and the idea of Diddy in jail and all of that is very dramatic. But I think it brings in so many different facets of all of our lives. And this idea of being a bystander and what's the responsibility of a bystander when you see something happening.
Yes.
And lots of questions around sexual proclivities and alternative lifestyles and drug use.
Yes.
And what's actually happening. And what's legal and what's not.
So that's going to be a big part of today's episode, you all. What's legal, what's not. Breaking down the charges that he is actually facing. Why is even a federal indictment on the table? We're going to get into all of that.
And I think the other thing that's really interesting, and you've heard it here first, is that this, in our opinion, is probably not the last of the charges.
Oh, for sure.
So I believe that the New York U.S. Attorney was trying to find a way, something to hook him on that would hold him so he wouldn't be perpetrating more harm.
Fair. And also, I think the press conference, the way that he was arrested versus turning himself in, all of this also sends a message to those bystanders and say, bruh, if you don't turn state, we coming for you next.
Yes. So I think it would be helpful just to put on the table what he's actually being held. Like, what are the charges?
Yes.
So he's held on 3 federal charges. One is racketeering, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and transportation to engage in prostitution.
Okay, now what's notably missing from those charges, and I know people at home are probably thinking the same thing as they listen to it or as they heard the news coverage, is anything around SA, which we abbreviate for YouTube, or DV.
Correct. And the kind of higher profile relationships that he was in are not part, as far as we know, of this indictment.
Yes.
So the harm that he perpetrated within his long-standing intimate relationships, like the video we saw,
is not named.
Not named. So all of these other people who come forward with civil suits against Diddy, those are separate and apart.
Okay. So then can you talk us through the types of charges we see? But first, why are they in federal court and not state court?
Okay, so, going back to common law. So the primary reason is that there's the sex trafficking and the transporting sex workers across state lines. So like for crimes that are multi-state involved, meaning that they transfer among state lines, so from New York to New Jersey or from Las Vegas to California, if any part of that crime happens as there's movement between the states, it essentially happens in federal court.
Yes.
And so we know that Diddy has multiple homes. He has access to private air travel. He's in multiple countries at any given time. And we know that in the allegations, much of the behavior happened over a period of time in many different locations with sex workers. And so the act of transporting sex workers across state lines, even if it's not by force, is a crime.
Period.
So that's something that's interesting, right? Because we think of federal crimes as really severe or really big, and many of them are.
Yeah.
But some are just federal crimes because of the state line distinction.
Gotcha.
So that's one. I think the other is financial. The racketeering charge is primarily financial, meaning that he used his business to procure allegedly illicit drugs and sex workers, and used his network from his business to sell those products to different people. So misappropriating funds.
Essentially. And also, let me just go on the record to say that a racketeering charge, from my understanding, a lot of that was used to like bring down the mob.
Yes.
And so it really is the federal government being creative in the way that they're able to bring down or hook criminal enterprises.
Right. And so we are not federal litigators. We have not practiced in federal court. But I think what's interesting is that this is a very creative indictment.
100%.
Which, on the one hand, has its advantages. And on the other hand, as we've talked about, potentially has some real risks for the government.
For sure. So what I told Margo is that there's somebody who is listening to these allegations. These are all allegations, by the way. And also, if I was his attorney, what I would be arguing is these were acts that were part of consent, number one, consensual relationships between adults. And again, the SA and the DD are actually not on the table. And so if I was his attorney, I would be thinking and arguing what's really being prosecuted is what some might argue are my client's sexual deviance or proclivities to have orgies with a lot of baby oil. It's not illegal.
But it's gross.
But it's disgusting, right? But it's like we don't get to
we don't
put people in prison for that.
No, and I think there's probably also a lot of questions around this concept of coercion.
Yes.
And the idea of consent, right? Like these were consenting adults who were in proximity to Diddy, maybe having had sexual relationships with Diddy or his people before.
Yes.
And going back and hanging out with them again. And this questioning of people's motives now.
Yes.
And I think what's really important for us to be unapologetic about is that while coercion might not be physical in nature, he might not have locked people. I mean, he may have, but he might not be locking people in a room or in a bathroom and physically abusing them in the way that we envision SA or DV. But the power that he held over people and the threats he used about ruining people's careers, the fact that he videotaped people without their consent and allegedly threatened to release that information, the fact that he plied people allegedly with drugs without their knowledge, right? So it's one thing, or even with their knowledge. So both are problematic, but I think we could go through it separately. Like, if someone is making decisions and they're under the influence and they don't know they're under the influence,
yes,
that is deeply concerning because their ability to consent is compromised. If someone is under the influence and knows they're under the influence, they still may feel like they can't say no and want to say no.
Yes.
And they still have the right to say no. And the network of people that surrounded Diddy and threatened people with harm, physical harm, social harm, and professional harm.
Yes.
And the idea of coercion being that while it might not have been a gun at someone's head or a knife at someone's throat, the fact that people felt as though they couldn't make any different choice in the moment is force.
And that is a really big part of abusive relationships.
Correct.
Which we definitely want to talk to you all about today, because oftentimes before it gets to a physical threat or actual physical harm, it starts with years and different forms of coercion. Before we saw Diddy assaulting Cassie in the hallway, for her to even get there, she had been coerced into relationships with him, right? It had been a form of mental abuse and psychological, likely torture, before we even get to the physical harm.
Totally. And I also think that we need to take some responsibility as a society. And one of our esteemed elders, Dr. Sharon, said to me about this case in particular, Justice Emirati.
Yes, Emirati.
That what we do with celebrity in this country is part of the problem.
Absolutely.
Right? Why are we holding people up to this pedestal when they're just people? They might be good rappers. They might have good style. They might be successful in business. but they're humans. And as we've said before, not one person can ruin an entire person's career. And the fact that people believe that he could, and people allowed other people to believe that, is part of the problem.
It's this ripple effect, right? He is the center of power, and then it's all these layers that surround him that protect him and then reinforce the power. Classic narcissist, classic megalomaniac, classic abuser in a large enterprise organization, in his case, an industry for sure.
And what about all the people who knew this was happening?
Right. So people are pointing to his, I think, chief of staff. I'm not sure her exact role. Coincidentally, I found it interesting that it is a woman, but we've talked time and time again on this podcast about how you don't have to be a man to advance the patriarchy. And so there's something about our proximity to power that I think makes people feel powerful. And to Dr. Sharon's point, also us putting celebrities on a pedestal, because what I told you is early on, and I don't know where these people stand today, but rappers like Slim Thug, and I'm sure the Black Manosphere, if such a thing is the actual name, all these podcasters types had been saying this was a conspiracy against Diddy, bring a black man down. He's our only black billionaire. What does this mean for us as a community if people who are successful can just be brought down by the criminal legal system?
Well, just because you're successful doesn't mean you have to follow the law.
Basically, I guess just because you're successful,
allegedly,
people like that, what I hear them saying is a woman's life, a woman of color, a black woman, that's immaterial. That person should be sacrificed in the pursuit of capitalist gain.
There's also something that kind of that sentiment, or kind of the essentializing what has happened, is so problematic in my mind, because it devalues the humanity of all of the victims.
Yes.
Right? So it's not like we can have compassion for people's trauma, which I imagine Diddy has some, right? And want him to get better and to not perpetrate more harm. But it's undisputed that he has harmed people. Right, and it's undisputed that the harm continues. Now, the extent of the harm we do not know, but he is on video beating the shit out of Cassie in a public space and throwing a glass vase at her. She could have died. Her eyeball could have fallen out. And so what I don't like about that is, what about Cassie?
Is what about Cassie? And it's this idea
just because Cassie's not a billionaire, she doesn't matter?
No, she doesn't matter. Or at the very least, it is always, because of people who have money, power, fame, success, it is always this delegitimizing of any claim against them that they have done harm. Because back to your point, well, he doesn't have to do X, Y, Z. He could have the world. Why would Bill Cosby have to drug people? Why would R. Kelly have to abuse victims for the way that he did over the years? They could have anybody. It's not true. The society, the man is just trying to bring the black man down. And I think we learned that in our community very, very young, about what it means to protect maleness and to protect the patriarchy, and that everyone else that is not within its orbit or not core to it just deserves to be sacrificed. Our preachers teach us that. The Black church teaches us that, unfortunately. Our schools teach us that. And we just go through life with this as a narrative, many times women being the ones that shepherd it the loudest as well. So I am so happy that we are seeing this day. And it's not just about the criminal legal charges for me, Margo. It's also about the movement that it took for us to get here.
Yeah. I also think there's a real question for those of us who are critical of our criminal legal system and its restorative or lack of restorative justice.
For sure.
About what do we do with crimes of SA and DV, and how do we prioritize the needs of the safety of the community and of the victims? And we don't have an answer for that. So we could be anti-carceral theoretically, but we don't have other alternatives. to keep people safe from him except incarcerating him. Because we know, and you were just telling me this, that there were allegations even while he was in New York, knowing he was going to be arrested, that he was engaging in some of this similar behavior.
So that's the allegation. I mean, they found the pink powder in his room, which is a concoction of narcotics that allegedly he uses for a good time, and to coerce and likely drug victims. And I think that's exactly what not one but two judges have said. Right, first he went for the magisterial court. The magistrate said no. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Go straight to jail. And that's where you're going to stay. And then he saw his judge, right, in the federal case. And his judge said the same thing. Nah, bruh, you're staying in jail because these are crimes that happen behind closed doors. And given the severity of the allegations, we can't trust you.
And there are also legitimate allegations of witness intimidation. So we know, we talked about this last week, right,
Girl.
that one woman came forward and said that she had been locked in a car by him.
Oh, that was Dandy Kane and Dirty Money.
Right.
So that's Dawn Richard.
Dawn Richard. And then some other woman came out like the next day or 2 days later saying that she never saw anything of that.
That's Kalana from Diddy Dirty Money. So yes.
And so an example, and at that time we said, well,
that's written by a lawyer.
Right. Obviously that statement was written by a lawyer. Obviously someone from Diddy's team or Diddy himself got to her and asked her to put out a statement.
Exactly.
And doing all this while he knew he was under federal investigation for these federal crimes.
Exactly.
So he has shown himself to engage in witness intimidation.
Well, yeah, because that's what we saw, right? I mean, what I'm assuming is that his phone records must have been subpoenaed because he called, texted this woman dozens upon dozens of times. And that also was on the Kelowna.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, dozens upon dozens of times. And so that is the wild part to me, that he thinks that he is above the law in every way. And so now we know that he is on watch for possibly threat of harming himself.
Oh, really?
He is on S-Watch for the threat of harming himself. And on the comments of a social media post, somebody said, "Diddy, stop. The judge has told you twice you're not getting out of jail." And meant to say, we don't know if this is really true. This might be a ploy and a play to find a way to either get into a different part of incarceration prior to trial, or to be able to get released on some like compassionate circumstance. I don't know. I do not mean to like deny someone's mental health allegations.
Well, I mean, I think it's reasonable to have a negative response to being held without bail and being denied a $50 million bail pending trial twice. I mean, he has reason to be concerned.
Yeah.
And for his safety.
Because we know what happens to these types of allegations and abusers when they are incarcerated. And so, and he also is in the same jail that Epstein was in when he was found unalived. Maybe by S. You all, I'm using these terms because, again, YouTube. But there are some allegations that something much more nefarious occurred. And so powerful people who have been charged with these types of crimes don't always make it out of incarceration alive. And so, yes, he does have real reason to be afraid. But so were his victims. So,
and continue to be.
Absolutely. So last thing I'll go on record to say is this is just a reminder of why it is important to have federal protections. And I was thinking about this recently, right? If it had not been for the federal government intervening in, for example, school segregation, ending of the enslavement of descendants of Africans in this country, passing Roe versus Wade before it was dismantled, there are a lot of protections that we have. Voting. That are a result of the federal government reminder to vote. Well, we know that the Southern District of New York, that court is one of the most aggressive, lethal, and effective federal courts in the country.
I think they were the office that charged Epstein and Harvey Weinstein, but like also Anna Delvey.
Yeah.
I mean, taking on really interesting, creative cases. I also think federal protections are particularly important for people who have a lot of capital in this country, because there's this idea that they don't like that they are above state law.
Yeah, that's actually really good.
You know, and they don't really have a residence. I mean, they have many residents, but they're not like a resident of a particular place. Maybe their kids are homeschooled or they have tutors or whatever. Like they're never in one place for very long. And this idea that just because you have access to mobility doesn't mean you're above any law.
Also, I would think resources as well. I mean, I would imagine the access to investigators and the number of attorneys in a federal district office versus like the state of Mississippi.
Oh, totally.
Could be like in
for sure. But I think when you think of flight risk,
oh, for sure,
and you think of who epitomizes a flight risk, someone like this is perfect because he could go anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Which is why he was trying to put not only his, but his mother's and his children's passports on the table to say, hey, take these. I promise you I'm not going anywhere. But it just very simply wasn't enough given the allegations. So you all sound off below or in our comments. Make sure you leave us a review over on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever it is that you listen to us, and leave us a comment here on YouTube if you are watching us. Let us know what else would you like to know about the case, and any other questions that you might have.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening to justUS. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to learn more about our podcast, be sure to check us out on our website at justuspodcast.com. You can also reach out to us there if you want to be featured on the show or if you have a business or a product that you think would be a good fit for our audience. Thanks again for listening.